Epictetus told his students that discipline was the path to freedom. But there was something he didn't tell most of them, something he only revealed to the few who were ready to hear it. Real discipline isn't about motivation. It isn't about willpower. It isn't about forcing yourself to do things you hate until you become a machine. Real discipline, the kind that the Stoics actually practiced, is about something far more brutal and far more liberating. It's about destroying the part of you that needs comfort. And most people, when they actually understand what that means, they run. They go back to their comfortable slavery, their soft discipline, their motivational videos that change nothing. This isn't for everyone, and Epictetus knew that. So he hid the full truth, waiting for the students who were strong enough to handle it. Welcome to Stoic Valor, where we don't sugarcoat ancient wisdom to make it easier to swallow. This is the place for people who are done with surface-level self-help and ready for the real work. The uncomfortable work, the work that actually transforms you instead of just making you feel temporarily inspired. If you came here looking for easy answers, this might not be for you. But if you're ready to understand what discipline really means, according to someone who went from slave to the freest man in Rome, you're exactly where you need to be. Picture Epictetus in Rome. Around 70 AD, he's not a philosopher yet. He's property. A slave owned by Epictetus, a powerful freedman in Nero's court. And one day, his master is twisting his leg. Slowly, watching him to see if he'll beg or scream, Epictetus looks up calmly and says, "If you keep doing that, you'll break it." The master keeps twisting. The leg snaps, and Epictetus, through what must be excruciating pain, simply says, "See, I told you it would break." No screaming, no begging, just calm observation. His master is disturbed, maybe even scared. How can a man in chains, with a broken leg, be more internally free than the man who broke it? That moment reveals everything about real discipline, and it's nothing like what you've been taught. You've been sold a version of discipline that's fundamentally about control. Control your schedule, control your habits, control your time. Wake up at 5 a.m., do your morning routine, check your boxes, hit your goals. And if you do it all perfectly, you'll be disciplined, you'll be free. But here's the brutal truth that Epictetus understood and most people never grasp. That's not discipline. That's just a more organized version of slavery. You're still being controlled, just by different masters. Your goals, your identity, your need to be productive, your fear of being seen as lazy, you've replaced external chains with internal ones and called it freedom. Real discipline. Stoic discipline is something completely different. And it's so uncomfortable that Epictetus didn't teach it to everyone. He taught basic principles to his general students, the ones who came to his lectures in Nicopolis, who wanted to learn philosophy as an intellectual exercise. But the deep truth, the brutal core of what discipline actually means, he reserved for the few who demonstrated they could handle it. And what is that truth? Discipline isn't about doing things. It's about destroying your dependence on things. It's about systematically removing your need for comfort, approval, success, and pleasure until you're genuinely free. Not free to do whatever you want. Free from needing anything. Think about the last time you failed at discipline. Maybe you were trying to build a habit. Wake up early, exercise daily, eat clean, work focused. And you did it for a few days, maybe even a few weeks. And then you broke. You slept in, you skipped the gym, you ordered takeout, you scrolled social media for hours, and you felt like a failure. Why did you break? The standard answer is that you lacked willpower. You weren't motivated enough. You didn't want it badly enough. But that's not what happened. What happened is, you were using discipline as a tool to get something: a better body, more productivity, a sense of accomplishment, an identity as a disciplined person. And the moment the cost exceeded the perceived benefit, you quit. Because your discipline was conditional. It depended on getting what you wanted. Epictetus would look at that and tell you that you never had discipline in the first place. You had a sophisticated form of desire. You desired the results of discipline more than you desired comfort in that moment. But desire is the opposite of discipline. Desire makes you dependent. It makes you a slave to outcomes you don't control. Real discipline is independence from outcomes. It's doing what's right regardless of whether it gets you what you want. It's exercising when you're tired, not because it will make you fit, but because physical training is part of being human. It's working when you don't feel like it, not because it will make you successful, but because meaningful work is how you express your nature. The result becomes irrelevant. The action itself is the point. Now here's where most people's minds rebel against this idea. If the result doesn't matter, why do anything at all? Why discipline yourself if you're not getting something from it? And that question reveals exactly why Epictetus didn't teach this to everyone. Because if you're asking that question, you're still thinking like a slave. You're still looking for a transaction. I do this hard thing, and I get that reward. But the Stoic understands that the hard thing is the reward. The discipline itself is freedom, not because it leads to freedom later. Because choosing to act according to your principles regardless of outcomes is the literal definition of freedom. You're no longer controlled by the need for results. You're no longer a slave to your desires. You act because it's right, and that makes you untouchable. Marcus Aurelius, who had everything you think you want, power, wealth, status, wrote something in his private journal that most people read and completely miss. He wrote, "Don't hope that events will turn out the way you want. Welcome events in whichever way they happen. This is the path to peace." He's not talking about being passive. He's talking about removing the condition you've placed on your peace. You've said, "I'll be at peace when I achieve this goal. I'll be happy when I get that outcome. I'll be satisfied when I become this identity." And every single one of those conditions makes you a slave, because now your internal state depends on external circumstances you barely control. The Stoic removes the condition. He commits to action without needing a specific outcome. And that's discipline. Not forcing yourself to do hard things while hoping for rewards. Choosing hard things because they're the right expression of your nature, regardless of rewards. But here's what Epictetus understood that makes this even more brutal. Most people can't do this. Not because they're weak. Because they're too attached. They've built their entire sense of self around external things. Their body, their career, their relationships, their achievements, and the idea of detaching from outcomes feels like death. Because in a sense, it's the death of the self you've been building. The one that needs validation, the one that needs success, the one that needs to be seen as disciplined. And most people aren't willing to kill that self. They'd rather stay enslaved by it, comfortable in their chains, motivated by their desires, and that's fine. Epictetus didn't judge them. He just didn't waste time teaching them something they weren't ready to hear. Ryan Holiday writes about this in Ego is the Enemy, when he discusses how attachment to outcomes corrupts the purity of action. But the principle goes back to Epictetus, who taught that the only good is virtue, and the only evil is the lack of it. Everything else, success, failure, health, sickness, wealth, poverty, it's indifferent. Preferred in some cases, but ultimately not good or evil. Your discipline shouldn't depend on achieving preferred it should exist independently. You act virtuously regardless of outcome. And when you can do that, when you genuinely don't need your discipline to produce results, that's when you're actually free. Not when you have perfect habits. When you have zero attachment to whether those habits produce what you want. James Clear talks about this from a different angle in Atomic Habits, when he discusses falling in love with the process instead of the outcome, but he's still operating within a framework where habits are tools to achieve something. The Stoic goes deeper. The process isn't a means to an end. The process is the end. Virtuous action is its own reward, not because it feels good, though sometimes it does, because it's the only thing you actually control. And focusing your entire life on the only thing you control is the definition of wisdom. Everything else is madness. Chasing things you can't control, depending on circumstances you can't guarantee, building your identity on foundations that can crumble. That's not discipline. That's elaborate slavery. Hold that thought, because what I'm about to share changes everything. The specific practices that Epictetus taught his advanced students. The ones who were ready for the brutal truth. They're not what you think discipline looks like. They're not about building habits or optimizing routines. They're about systematically destroying your need for things to be different than they are. And when you understand how to do that, when you actually practice it, everything changes. But knowing this changes nothing if you don't know how to apply it. And the way you apply it is not what you think. So how do you actually do this? How do you build real discipline, the kind that makes you free instead of just more productive? Let me show you exactly what Epictetus taught, not to his casual students, but to the ones who were serious about transformation. Because there's a massive difference between intellectual understanding and lived practice. And that difference is everything. The first practice Epictetus taught is something that sounds almost cruel until you understand its purpose. Deliberately choose discomfort, not as punishment, not as some masochistic test of will, but as training to remove your dependence on comfort. Most people's entire lives are organized around avoiding discomfort. They stay in jobs they hate because changing is uncomfortable. They avoid difficult conversations because confrontation is uncomfortable. They don't pursue their real goals because the risk of failure is uncomfortable. And they wonder why they feel enslaved. It's because they are. They're enslaved by their need for comfort. And the master that controls you through your need for comfort is crueler than any human master. Here's the practice. Once a week, deliberately choose something uncomfortable. Sleep on the floor instead of your bed. Take a cold shower instead of hot. Fast for a day instead of eating when you want. Sit with boredom instead of reaching for your phone. And while you're doing it, don't do it to build discipline or prove something. Do it to notice your mind screaming at you to stop. Notice the part of you that says this is unnecessary, that you deserve comfort, that there's no point to this suffering. That voice is your master, and every time you obey it, you reinforce your slavery. Every time you continue despite it, you weaken its control. You're not building willpower, you're destroying dependence. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works. Imagine you're sitting at your desk, trying to work on something important, and the urge to check social media hits. Strong, insistent, just 5 minutes. Just a quick break. What do most people do? They either give in immediately, or they white-knuckle it, fighting the urge. Using willpower like a finite resource that depletes. The Stoic does something different. He sits with the urge, doesn't give in, doesn't fight, just observes. There's the desire for distraction. Interesting. It feels like I need to check my phone. But do I? What happens if I just sit here and feel the discomfort of not checking? And here's what happens. The urge peaks, then it fades, and you realize you didn't need to check, you just wanted to, and the want had no actual power except what you gave it. That's the practice, not resisting desires, observing them until they lose their power. And this applies to everything. The desire for approval, the desire for success, the desire for comfort, the desire for pleasure. You don't fight them. You don't indulge them. You sit with them. You watch them arise, peak, and fade. And slowly, over weeks and months of this practice, you realize that none of these desires have any actual authority over you. They're just sensations, just thoughts, just neurological patterns. And you can choose to act or not act on them. That's freedom, not the absence of desire. The ability to choose your action independent of desire. The second practice is even more confrontational. Epictetus called it negative visualization, though it goes deeper than just imagining loss. Every morning, before you do anything else, imagine losing everything you're attached to. Your health, your relationships, your wealth, your reputation, your goals, your identity, all of it gone, and sit with that. Feel the fear, feel the resistance, and then ask yourself, if I lost all of this, could I still be virtuous? Could I still act according to my principles? Could I still be free? And the brutal answer that most people don't want to face is that if you can't be virtuous without those things, you're not actually disciplined. You're just your virtue depends on favorable circumstances, and that's not virtue. That's conditional goodness, which is worthless. Here's how this practice destroys your dependence. When you imagine loss repeatedly, when you mentally rehearse having nothing, you start to realize that your okayness doesn't depend on having anything. You can be okay with nothing, and once you know that, genuinely know it, not just intellectually but experientially, then nothing can control you. You're not working hard because you need success. You're working hard because it's right. You're not being kind because you need approval. You're being kind because it's who you are. The outcomes become irrelevant, and that's when discipline becomes effortless. Not because it's easy, because it's no longer dependent on motivation or willpower. It's just what you do. Regardless, now what I'm about to share is counterintuitive but essential. The third practice is about redefining what you consider you. Most people identify with their body, their thoughts, their emotions, their circumstances, and because they identify with these things, they're controlled by them. When the body is uncomfortable, they suffer. When thoughts are negative, they suffer. When emotions are difficult, they suffer. When circumstances are bad, they suffer. But Epictetus taught something radical. You are not your body. You are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are not your circumstances. You are the capacity to choose your response to all of those things. That capacity is the only thing that's actually you. Everything else is external. Here's the practice. Every time something happens, before you react, pause and identify what's actually you and what's not. Your body is tired. That's not you. That's a physical state. Your mind is anxious. That's not you. That's a mental state. Your emotions are angry. That's not you. That's an emotional state. Your circumstances are difficult. That's not you. That's external reality. So what are you? You're the awareness that notices all of this. And you're the will that chooses how to respond. That's it. That's the only thing you actually control. And when you identify with that, instead of all the other stuff, discipline becomes simple. Not easy, simple. You choose your response based on your principles. Every time, regardless of physical state, mental state, emotional state, or circumstances. Because none of that is you. Most people hear this and think it sounds like detachment, like you're becoming cold or unfeeling, but that's not what happens. What happens is you become stable. You're no longer thrown around by every change in your body, mind, emotions, or circumstances. You're grounded in the only thing that's actually constant, your capacity to choose, and from that ground, you can engage with life fully. You can feel emotions without being controlled by them. You can have desires without being enslaved by them. You can face difficulties without being destroyed by them. That's real discipline, not suppressing your humanity, mastering it. But there's a problem most people don't see coming. You can do all of these practices and still fail at real discipline if you're doing them for the wrong reason. If you're practicing discomfort to become tougher, if you're doing negative visualization to reduce anxiety, if you're redefining self to achieve peace, you're still operating from desire. You still need an outcome. And that need will eventually make you quit when the practices don't deliver what you want fast enough. The brutal truth that Epictetus reserved for his most advanced students is this. You have to practice for no reason. You choose discomfort not to get tougher. You choose it because choosing difficulty over ease is virtuous. You practice negative visualization not to reduce anxiety. You practice it because accepting impermanence is wise. You redefine self not to achieve peace. You do it because it's true. The practice itself is the point, not what it gets you. If this is hitting different, if you're realizing that everything you thought about discipline was backwards, then subscribe to Stoic Valor, because we're not building an audience here. We're building a community of people who are willing to do the real work. The uncomfortable work, the work that doesn't promise quick results, but delivers permanent transformation. We're just getting started, and what we're about to explore will show you that this isn't just philosophy. This is how real people, in the modern world, have used these brutal practices to become genuinely free. But does this actually work in the real world, when you're not a philosopher but a regular person with regular problems? Let me show you. But does this actually work when you're dealing with modern life? With jobs and relationships and bills and stress, when you can't just retreat to a philosophical school and contemplate virtue all day? Let me show you what happens when real people apply these brutal practices to real situations. Because theory is beautiful, but transformation happens in reality, not in philosophy books. There was a man I'll call Alex. High achiever, successful career. Everything looked perfect from outside, but inside, he was a slave. Slave to his need for achievement. Every project had to succeed. Every goal had to be met. Every metric had to improve, and the pressure was crushing him. He couldn't enjoy his success because he was always anxious about the next thing. He couldn't rest because rest felt like falling behind. He couldn't fail because failure felt like death. And then he got fired, not for poor performance, corporate restructuring, and his entire identity collapsed because he'd built everything on achievement. And when achievement was taken away, there was nothing left. He found Epictetus during the darkest period, specifically the end, and one passage destroyed him and rebuilt him at the same time. Don't demand that things happen as you wish, but wish that they happen as they do happen, and you will go on well. He realized he'd been making his okayness conditional on outcomes, and outcomes aren't up to him, so he'd been enslaved to things outside his control. He started practicing what Epictetus taught, deliberately choosing discomfort. He stopped checking job boards compulsively, sat with the anxiety instead, practiced negative visualization, imagined staying unemployed permanently, asked himself if he could still be virtuous without a title, redefined self, realized he wasn't his career. He was the capacity to respond virtuously to whatever happened, including unemployment. Here's what happened. First few weeks were hell. Every part of him screamed to go back to the old pattern, desperately seeking the next position, defining himself by his resume. But he held the practice, and something shifted. The anxiety didn't go away, but it stopped controlling him. He could sit with it, observe it, act despite it. He got offers, turned some down because they violated his principles, something he never would have done before, took a position that paid less, but aligned with his values. And for the first time in his career, he was free. Not because circumstances were perfect, because his okayness no longer depended on them being perfect. Contrast this with another case. Woman, similar situation, lost her job, but instead of practicing Stoic discipline, she did what most people do. She let her identity collapse. She made the job loss mean something about her worth. She spent months in bitterness and when she finally got another job, she was right back in the same pattern. Enslaved to achievement, dependent on external validation. Nothing changed. What? Because she never did the internal work. She never destroyed her dependence on outcomes. She just waited for better outcomes. And better outcomes with the same dependence is just a temporary reprieve from suffering. Not freedom. Ryan Holiday documents this pattern in The Obstacle is the Way. The people who transform adversity aren't the ones who avoid it or overcome it through sheer force. They're the ones who use it as training, as an opportunity to practice independence from outcomes. Same obstacle, two completely different relationships with it. One person is destroyed by it, the other is liberated by it. The difference isn't the obstacle, it's the practice. Let me give you another case. Athlete, training for Olympics, career-ending injury. His entire life was built around his sport, his identity, his relationships, his purpose, everything. And suddenly it's gone. Most athletes in this position spiral. Depression, substance abuse, feeling like life is over. He went a different direction. He applied Epictetus's teaching about the dichotomy of control. He didn't control his injury. He didn't control the end of his athletic career, but he controlled his response. And his response was to practice radical acceptance, not positive thinking, not pretending he wasn't devastated. Acceptance. This happened. It's real. And his virtue doesn't depend on being an athlete. It depends on how he responds to not being an athlete anymore. He practiced deliberately choosing discomfort. Instead of numbing the pain with distractions, he sat with it, felt it fully, practiced negative visualization, imagined staying injured forever, asked himself if he could still be virtuous without his sport, and the answer, painfully, was yes. He redefined self. He wasn't his body's capabilities. He was his character, his capacity to respond with courage and wisdom to whatever happened, including the end of the dream he'd chased his whole life. And from that realization, he rebuilt, not back to what he was, into something different. Coach, mentor, someone who helps other athletes navigate adversity. He told me something profound. Losing my career was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I'm glad it happened, because it forced me to stop being enslaved by it. That's the brutal truth Epictetus taught. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is exactly what frees you. Not because suffering is good, because it destroys your illusions about what you need to be okay. And when your illusions are destroyed, you can build something real. Something that can't be taken because it doesn't depend on circumstances. Now, let's talk about someone who applied the practice of redefining self in a different context. Entrepreneur, building a company, poured everything into it: money, time, relationships, health, and the company failed, spectacularly, publicly, and he was left with debt, damaged reputation, and the feeling that he'd wasted years of his life. Most people in this position either quit entirely or immediately chase the next thing, trying to prove themselves. He did neither. He practiced Stoic discipline. He sat with the failure, didn't run from it, didn't try to fix it immediately, just observed his mind's desperate attempts to make it mean something about his worth. And then he asked the Stoic question: am I my company's success? No. Am I my reputation? No. Am I my financial status? No. Then what am I? The capacity to respond virtuously regardless of any of that. From that realization, he started over. Not frantically, calmly, with discipline that didn't depend on success. He worked on a new venture, but this time his okayness wasn't tied to its succeeding. He could fail again and be fine. Not happy about it, but fine. His virtue didn't depend on it. And paradoxically, that detachment made him more effective. He made better decisions because they weren't fear. He took smarter risks because he wasn't terrified of loss. He built something sustainable because he wasn't desperate for quick wins. 3 years later, successful again, but more importantly, free. The success didn't enslave him because he knew he didn't need it. Mark Manson writes about this in The Subtle Art when he talks about how accepting negative possibilities paradoxically makes you more capable of positive outcomes. But it goes back to Epictetus. When you genuinely don't need outcomes, you make better decisions. When you're enslaved by needing things to work out, you make desperate decisions. And desperate decisions usually fail. So the person who practices Stoic discipline, who destroys their dependence on outcomes, they're not just freer, they're more effective, not because effectiveness is the goal, but because it's a natural byproduct of operating from freedom, instead of slavery. One more case because this shows the full picture. Someone dealing with chronic pain, years of it, tried everything, nothing worked, and the pain was destroying their life. Not just physically, mentally. They were angry at their body, angry at the unfairness, angry at the limitations. And that anger was making everything worse. They found Stoic philosophy, specifically Epictetus's teaching, that you are not your body. And at first it sounded like nonsense. Of course they're their body. The pain is in their body. But they tried the practice anyway. When pain flared, instead of identifying with it, they observed it. There is pain in the leg. That's not me. That's a sensation the body is experiencing. I am the awareness, observing the pain and choosing how to respond to it. And something remarkable happened. The pain didn't go away, but the suffering decreased dramatically. Because suffering isn't pain. Suffering is pain plus resistance. Pain plus the story that it shouldn't be happening. Pain plus identification with the body. When they stopped resisting, stopped the story, stopped identifying, the pain was just a sensation. Unpleasant, but not destroying them. They could live with it, function with it, be okay despite it. That's the brutal truth. You can't always control your circumstances, but you can always control your relationship with your circumstances. And that control is the only freedom that actually exists. These aren't special people. They're regular people who applied brutal practices, who destroyed their dependence on comfort, outcomes, and circumstances, who redefined what they are, and who discovered that real discipline isn't about forcing yourself to do hard things. It's about being free enough to choose hard things without needing them to produce results. The same practices available to you right now. So the question becomes, are you willing to do what's actually required? Not what's comfortable. What's required? Remember what we started with. Epictetus had a truth about discipline that he didn't teach everyone. Something brutal. Something most people couldn't handle. Now you understand what it was. Real discipline isn't about building habits or forcing yourself to do hard things. It's about systematically destroying your dependence on comfort, outcomes, and circumstances until you're genuinely free. And most people can't do that. Not because they're weak. Because they don't want to. They want the benefits of discipline without the price of freedom. They want to be effective while staying enslaved. And you can't have both. Let me bring this full circle. What Epictetus discovered, what every Stoic lived, what modern psychology is barely beginning to understand, is that your slavery isn't external, it's internal. You're not enslaved by your circumstances. You're enslaved by your dependence on your circumstances being a certain way. And the only path to freedom is destroying that dependence. Not managing it, not optimizing it, destroying it through practices that are deliberately uncomfortable, through confronting truths you've been avoiding, through redefining who you are at the deepest level. That's discipline. Not the discipline that makes you productive, the discipline that makes you free. But here's the part that most people resist with everything they have. This isn't a technique. This isn't a life hack. This isn't something you do for 6 weeks to level up and then go back to normal. This is a complete restructuring of how you see yourself and your relationship with reality. And it's permanent. Once you genuinely understand that you're not your body, your thoughts, your emotions, or your circumstances, you can't unknow it. Once you've destroyed your dependence on outcomes, you can't rebuild it. Once you're free, you can't go back to comfortable slavery. And that terrifies people. Because comfortable slavery is familiar. Freedom is not. So here's what you need to ask yourself right now, and I mean right now, before you close this video and go back to your life. Are you actually willing to be free? Not theoretically, actually. Are you willing to practice discomfort weekly, even when there's no visible benefit? Are you willing to imagine losing everything you're attached to every morning? Are you willing to redefine yourself as something other than your body, mind, emotions, and circumstances? Are you willing to act according to virtue, regardless of whether it produces the outcomes you want? Because if you're not willing to do those things, you're not interested in discipline. You're interested in better slavery, more comfortable chains, more sophisticated dependence, and that's fine. Epictetus didn't judge it. He just didn't waste his time teaching freedom to people who wanted better slavery. Let me paint two futures for you. Future 1, you watch this video, feel challenged, maybe even inspired, and then you go back to your life. You try to be more disciplined, wake up earlier, work harder, build better habits, and maybe you succeed for a while, but you're still doing it all for outcomes, for achievement, for identity, for approval, for the feeling of being disciplined. And when those outcomes don't come, or when they come and don't satisfy you, you'll crash. You'll wonder why discipline feels so hard, why you can't maintain it, why you keep failing. And you'll look for another video, another book, another system, never realizing that the problem isn't your discipline, it's your dependence. You're trying to build freedom on top of slavery, and it doesn't work. Future 2. You watch this video, and you make a different choice. Tonight, you practice. You choose one deliberate discomfort. Cold shower, sleeping on the floor, fasting, sitting with boredom, something, and you don't do it to get tougher or prove something. You do it to observe your mind screaming at you to stop. Tomorrow morning, you practice negative visualization. You imagine losing one thing you're attached to. Vividly feel the fear, and ask yourself if you could still be virtuous without it. You start redefining self. Every time you feel, or think, or want something, you pause and remind yourself, that's not me, that's a state. I am the awareness and the will, that's all. And you do this every day, not perfectly. The Stoics never demanded perfection, but consistently, and slowly, over weeks and months, something changes. Not in your circumstances, maybe your circumstances get worse, but in you, in your relationship with your circumstances, you notice you're not as controlled by comfort, not as devastated by setbacks, not as dependent on success, not as enslaved by desire. You're freer, not because you have more, because you need less. And that freedom, that independence from circumstances, that's what discipline actually is. Not the habit stack, not the morning routine, the internal state that allows you to act virtuously regardless of what happens. Here's the challenge I'm giving you. Not someday, not when you're ready. Tonight, before you sleep, practice one thing. Deliberately choose discomfort, just one thing. And while you're doing it, observe your mind. Watch it tell you this is unnecessary. Watch it bargain with you. Watch it try to make you stop. And don't stop, not because stopping is weak, but because continuing is practice and not being controlled by your need for comfort. That's it. That's the beginning. One practice, one night, and see what happens. See if you can handle the brutal truth that Epictetus reserved for his serious students. That discipline isn't about doing more, it's about needing less. Epictetus wrote something that most people read as abstract philosophy but is actually a precise instruction manual. He wrote, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." Read that again. The only worthy goal? Not success, not achievement, not productivity. Freedom. And freedom is won by disregarding, not controlling, not optimizing, disregarding things outside your control. Your circumstances, your outcomes, other people's opinions, your body's comfort, your mind's anxiety, your emotions' demands, all of it outside your control, all of it irrelevant to your virtue. And when you genuinely disregard it, when you act based on principle instead of circumstance, you're free, completely, permanently, unshakably free. If you want to continue this journey, if you're one of the few who's actually serious about freedom instead of just better slavery, subscribe to Stoic Valor. We're not here for everyone. We're here for the people who are willing to do the brutal work, the uncomfortable work, the work that doesn't promise quick results but delivers permanent transformation. Every video we create is designed to challenge you, to confront you, to give you the practices that actually work instead of the ones that just feel good. That's what we're building here. A community of people who chose freedom, no matter the cost. Drop a comment telling me, are you willing to practice? Not theoretically, actually. What's one deliberate discomfort you're committing to this week? Your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to finally start their own practice. And if you know someone who's enslaved by their need for comfort, for success, for approval, send them this video. Not to judge them, to offer them what Epictetus offered his serious students. A path to freedom, if they're ready for it. Marcus Aurelius, who had every comfort and chose discipline anyway, wrote this: "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's it. That's the entire teaching. You don't control what happens, you control your response. And your response is the only thing that matters. Not because it produces outcomes, because it's the only thing that's actually you. Everything else is circumstance. And circumstance has no power except what you give it. Stop giving it power. Start practicing freedom. Not tomorrow. Not when things get easier. Now, this moment. That's where discipline lives. That's where freedom waits. That's where Epictetus is still teaching, 2,000 years later, to the students who are ready to hear the brutal truth. See you in the next one.